I have served in the Halcroft household for 31 years, and I have witnessed a great many things that should have shamed England's finest families into silence. I have seen a baronet weep at the card table. I have seen a marchioness pour claret over her lady's maid for the crime of bringing the wrong shade of gloves. I have seen men of title and standing do small, ruinous things to people who could not defend themselves, and I have watched those people swallow their dignity like a bitter draught and carry on. But I have never seen anything like what was done to Miss Emmeline Halcroft on the 14th of November, in the reception room of her late father's estate, with the candles burning too brightly and the solicitors watching from behind their papers as though they were witnessing a livestock auction and not the sale of a gentleman's daughter. Her father, God rest his muddled soul, had died in September with debts I will not enumerate here because the numbers are shameful enough to make the walls blush. He had been a kind man and a reckless one, and the combination had reduced his family to this: a widow in fragile health who wept quietly in the upstairs room, and a daughter of 23 who stood in the center of the reception hall wearing her best gray dress, which was not very best, and not very gray any longer, and listened to her uncle, Mr. Aldrich Halcroft, explain to the assembled gentlemen what was on offer. "The estate is spoken for," her uncle said, with the smooth indifference of a man reciting a legal notice. "The furniture likewise. As for the girl, she is presentable, she is young, and whoever takes her takes also the goodwill of the family name, such as it is. She requires no dowry. She requires only a man willing to absorb what remains of the debt and provide her mother with a modest income in exchange." He did not look at Emmeline as he said it. He looked at the gentlemen. She looked at no one. She stood with her hands folded, her chin at a precise, careful angle, and I watched her from my place near the sideboard and thought, she is memorizing this. She is committing every face in this room to memory, and she will not forget a single one of them. There were 6 men in the room. I will not name them. 3 were merchants who had heard the rumor and arrived with the loose, speculative energy of men who buy at the low. 1 was a widower of 60 who kept glancing at the door as though he hoped to be interrupted by an emergency. 1 was a young viscount's second son with a small income and a large appetite for convenience. And 1 was the Duke of Thornvale. I had not expected him. I do not think anyone had expected him. He had arrived without announcement shortly before the hour and stationed himself against the far wall with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression I had come to learn was his default, a kind of watchful severity that discouraged conversation. The Duke of Thornvale was not a man who inspired casual acquaintance. He was broadly shouldered and dark-haired, still on the near side of 40, with a jaw like a closing door and eyes that were very still and very dark and missed almost nothing. He had served in 2 campaigns before his elder brother's death brought the title to him. He had run the Thornvale estates with a rigor that had doubled their yield in 8 years. He was not liked in the way that agreeable men are liked, but he was respected in the way that a mountain range is respected, universally and at a distance. He said nothing during the uncle's recitation. He simply watched Emmeline. She did not look at him. She looked at a fixed point somewhere above the fireplace mantel, and she breathed, and she did not flinch. When the uncle had finished, there was an uncomfortable stirring. The merchant nearest the window offered a figure. It was insultingly low, and even he seemed to know it because he said it quickly and then looked at his shoes. The widower of 60 cleared his throat and said he would need to think on it. The Viscount's second son offered marginally more than the merchant and paired it with a smile that was entirely too pleased with itself. Then the Duke of Thornvale straightened from the wall. "Double the debt," he said, "cleared in full this week. The widow receives an income of 250 per annum for the remainder of her life, paid from Thornvale directly. The young woman is not a transaction. She is a free party to any arrangement, and she will tell me herself whether she agrees, not you." The room went very still. Her uncle's expression passed through surprise, then calculation, then a poorly concealed relief that was almost worse than the greed. "That is highly generous, Your Grace, and I'm sure." "I was not speaking to you," the Duke said. He crossed the room. Not quickly, there was nothing hurried about him, but with the kind of deliberate, unhurried purpose that clears a path through a crowd without anyone understanding how. He stopped in front of Emmeline, and he looked at her, and he waited. She looked back at him. For the first time that morning, her eyes focused on something in the room rather than above it. "Miss Halcroft," he said very quietly, I am the Duke of Thornvale. I am not a romantic man, and I will not pretend to be one. What I am is honest. I have observed your situation, and I find it beneath you. I am in need of a wife, not urgently, not desperately, but genuinely, and I believe you are in need of a choice, which no one in this room has seen fit to offer you. I am offering it now. You may refuse, and I will still pay the debt because what is happening here is wrong, and I am capable of doing something about it. But if you agree, if you find the proposal tolerable, then I will do right by you. You have my word. I have replayed this moment many times in the years since. He did not say she was beautiful, though she was. He did not say he loved her, though, as I would understand later, something in the past quarter hour had done a violence to his careful self-containment that he had not yet identified. He did not make her a promise of feeling he could not yet be certain of. He made her a promise of conduct, because conduct was what he knew himself capable of guaranteeing. She studied him for a long moment, the gray dress, the careful chin. The hands that had been folded since the beginning, and were folded still. You mean it, she said. It was not quite a question. Yes. You would pay the debt regardless. Yes. Then, she said, I want to understand something before I answer. Why? You came here today without announcement. You know what this meeting was arranged to accomplish. Why did you come? He was quiet for a moment. The room was so still I could hear the fire shift. Because I was told this was happening, he said, and I found I could not stay away. Something moved in her face, very briefly, then it settled. I accept your proposal, Your Grace, she said, on the condition that I am permitted to manage my mother's household personally, and that any arrangement between us be entered honestly, with neither party pretending to a warmth they do not feel, if that is the case. Agreed. Then we understand each other. I believe we do. Her uncle stepped forward with the air of a man who has just watched a transaction exceed his most optimistic projection. Excellent, quite excellent, if we could speak to the terms. You may speak to my solicitor, the Duke said without taking his eyes from Emmeline. I am finished here. They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the parish church near Thornvale's estate in the North Country. I know this because I went with them. Emmeline asked that I be brought along as part of the household, and the Duke agreed without apparent hesitation, which surprised me more than I expected. He was, I was discovering, a man of very few unnecessary refusals. The estate at Thornvale was not what I had imagined from the title. I had expected something cold and imposing, halls too long to be warm, furniture too fine to be sat upon, the accumulated grandeur of a dukedom arranged for the benefit of visitors, and not for the comfort of the people who lived there. What I found instead was a house that had clearly been managed by someone with a systematic mind and no interest in performance. The rooms were clean and proportioned sensibly. The fires were laid correctly. The staff had been there long enough to know each other's names, which is rarer than it ought to be in houses of this size and reflects, I think, on the man who ran it. The library was extraordinary, 2 full walls, floor to ceiling, organized in a manner that suggested someone had thought carefully about the relation between subjects and not simply accumulated volumes to fill space. The kitchen garden was the most well-ordered I had ever seen in 30 years of noting such things. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penwarren, was a stout woman of practical temperament who had served the Thornvale household since before the present Duke's title passed to him. She received Emmeline with a correct formality and, I thought, a certain veiled assessment. In 30 years I had also become something of a student of the assessments that housekeepers perform on new mistresses, and Mrs. Penwarren's was thorough and unhurried. She walked Emmeline through the linen cupboards on the second morning, explained the household rotation, showed her the inventory book, and waited. Emmeline asked the right questions, not performative questions, not the questions of a woman establishing authority she does not yet possess, the genuine questions of someone trying to understand how a thing actually works. Mrs. Penwarren's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, from assessment to something approaching respect. Emmeline moved through the house in the first days with the careful attention of someone, assembling a picture from its pieces. She did not make a great show of settling in. She simply observed, and then she began, very quietly, to be useful. She asked the housekeeper about the linen inventory. She sat with the estate accounts, which the Duke apparently had not expected, given the slight stilling of his expression when he found her at his desk, and she identified an error in the grain calculations that had been quietly costing the estate a modest sum for 3 years. She said nothing dramatic about this. She simply corrected it and left a note explaining the adjustment. He found the note. He found her shortly afterward in the garden. I was trimming the hedge at the far end and did not make myself known. I am not proud of this. You found the discrepancy, he said. It was not difficult. The column was added correctly, but the unit conversion was wrong. No one has found it in 3 years. No one was looking. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you. She looked up from the plant she had been examining, some herb she had been trying to identify. You don't have to thank me. I live here now. It seemed sensible to be useful. Most people in your position would not consider it their concern. Most people in my position, she said, with a dry precision that I had come to love in her, did not spend 2 years helping their father understand why his accounts were wrong before he found men willing to explain it to him rather than correct it. He looked at her. There was something in his face I had not seen there before. Not tenderness exactly, not yet, but the first loosening of a guard that had been kept for a very long time. How long did you do that? He said. Until he stopped listening. Then I did it anyway and didn't tell him. He did not reply immediately. Then very quietly, that must have been lonely. She blinked. I think it was the last answer she had expected. Yes, she said after a moment, it was. They stood in the garden in the November light, and the Duke of Thornvale, who was not a romantic man and had said so, did not move for a long moment, as though the ground had shifted slightly beneath him, and he was taking careful account of the new angle. Come inside, he said finally. It's cold. She came. I will not pretend that the weeks that followed were simple. They were not. 2 people who have agreed to honesty over warmth must still discover what warmth, in fact, looks like between them, and that discovery is not always graceful. There were dinners that ended in silence. There were evenings in the library where they read at opposite ends of the room and said very little, and the quality of that silence shifted, night by night, in ways that were difficult to name and impossible to ignore. He brought her a book on agricultural botany after she had expressed interest in the kitchen garden without comment. She left a corrected copy of the estate's calendar of accounts on his desk with a note that was precise and also, somehow, funny. He read it twice. I know because I brought the tea. What I can say with confidence is this: she never performed. She did not arrange herself into the picture of a devoted wife for the benefit of the household or the visiting neighbors. She was simply herself, capable and dry and quietly, stubbornly honest, and the effect this had on the Duke of Thornvale was something I watched with the same helpless interest I imagined one feels watching a stone wall slowly decide to let in light. It was his cousin Reginald who broke things open, as it happens. Reginald Ashcroft arrived in December with a wife and 2 opinions, and a mouth that had never learned to stay closed at dinner. He was the sort of man who fills a room with himself and considers this a gift to the room. He had known the Duke since childhood, and apparently believed this granted him a latitude that was not, in fact, his to claim. He spent the first evening asking Emmeline with a surface of genial curiosity about her father's debts, the specific figures, the nature of the sale, whether she had had any other offers. He framed each question as a pleasantry, the way certain men frame their cruelest inquiries, and he smiled through all of them. Emmeline answered each one with the same quiet precision she brought to estate accounts. She gave him the information he asked for, without embarrassment and without embellishment, and met his eyes steadily, and did not look away. I watched the Duke across the table. He had said very little for the past 10 minutes. His glass had not been raised. Well, Reginald said, reaching for the salt with the confidence of a man who has never in his life felt that he has gone too far. I suppose it worked out rather well for everyone. The Duke needed a wife of some description, and you needed a, shall we say, rescue. Reginald, the Duke said. It was not a loud word. It was, in fact, spoken quite calmly. But something in the quality of it made the table go quiet the way a room goes quiet before weather arrives. Reginald blinked. I only meant. I know what you meant. The Duke set down his glass. My wife corrected an accounting error last month that recovered 3 years of quiet losses on the grain yields. She reorganized the linen rotation in a way that our housekeeper tells me has made the household run more efficiently than it has in a decade. She has learned the names of every member of this staff, individually, and they would follow her to the ends of the earth for it. She has not asked me for anything she was not owed. and she has given this house more than I had any right to expect." He looked at Reginald with an expression I can only describe as the precise moment a man stops being polite and starts being honest. She did not need a rescue. She needed a fair transaction which she was not being offered. I was glad to provide one. Whether it worked out well for everyone is no concern of yours. Reginald's wife, a quiet woman named Cecily who had, I suspected, spent 12 years of marriage quietly not looking at ceilings, looked at the ceiling. Reginald looked at his plate. The two other guests at the table, a neighboring landowner and his wife who had arrived with no particular opinions and were now visibly glad of it, studied their soup. Emmeline looked at her husband. He did not look back immediately. He was refilling his glass with the particular unhurried focus of a man who has said precisely what he meant to say and does not feel the need to underline it. The room was very quiet. I believe even the candles were holding their breath. But when he did look up, and their eyes met across the candlelit table, his dark and steady, hers with something in them I had not seen before, something newly certain. What passed between them was not something I have the vocabulary for exactly. It was the look of two people who have been conducting a careful, honest arrangement and have just realized, simultaneously and without warning, that the arrangement has quietly become something else. Something that had been slowly accumulating itself for 6 weeks had arrived, and it had a name, though neither of them said it aloud. Reginald attempted to recover the mood after dinner with a story about a hunting expedition that no one asked for. He received polite silence for his trouble. His wife Cecily spoke briefly to Emmeline near the fire, in a tone I was too far away to hear, but which seemed, from Emmeline's response, to be an apology offered in the language of those who have had to become fluent in it. Reginald and his wife departed 2 days later, no great loss. It was 3 evenings after that when I carried the late tea to the library and found them both still there at 10:30, which was not usual. They were not at opposite ends of the room. They were at the same table, which was new. She was reading, he was reviewing a document. But their chairs were close, and his hand rested near hers on the table, not touching but near, in the way that is sometimes more significant than touching, and neither of them appeared to have noticed, or at least neither of them had moved. I set down the tray as quietly as I could and left, and I did not mention it to anyone. Christmas came, and with it a letter from Emmeline's mother, who was wintering with a cousin and in better health than expected. Emmeline read the letter at breakfast with the expression I had learned to read as relief doing its best impression of composure. The Duke watched her read it. "She is well," he said when she set the letter down. "Better, the income has made a considerable difference. She writes that she has had enough coal to keep the rooms warm, which is—" She stopped. "It sounds like a small thing." "It isn't." She looked at him. "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked back at her, and this time neither of them looked away for quite a while. "There is a concert in the village on the 23rd, he said eventually, "if you wish to go." She considered this. "I didn't know you attended concerts." "I don't generally." "Then why?" "Because you mentioned in October that you missed music," he said. I remembered. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences that had preceded it in those first weeks. This was not the silence of two people navigating an agreed arrangement with careful courtesy. This was the silence of two people who have arrived somewhere together, without quite knowing when they departed. "I would like to go," she said, "very much." "Then we'll go." The concert was held in the village assembly room, decorated with pine boughs and candles that had been arranged by someone with more enthusiasm than precision, and the quartet was not polished but was earnest, and the room was warm. We sat in the second row because Emmeline had pointed out that the first row would put the musicians uncomfortably aware of the Duke's expression, which was a fair assessment, and he had laughed, actually laughed, which startled the footman standing nearest him and startled me also, because I had not heard it before. They sat side by side in the assembly room, and she leaned forward slightly when the second movement began, a piece she knew, I could tell, because her breath changed, and he watched her listen. I have seen men look at women that way. It is not a common sight. It is the look of a man who has stopped cataloging and started simply seeing, and in the seeing has understood something he cannot unsee. The Duke of Thornvale, who was not a romantic man, looked at his wife in the candle light of a village assembly room while an imperfect quartet played their earnest best, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing I had ever seen him wear. On the way home in the carriage, she said, "You laughed earlier." "I did. I don't think I've heard you laugh before." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't have occasion for it generally." She turned to look at him in the darkness of the carriage. "You should," she said. "It suits you." He looked at her. Something in him, I think, came entirely undone. "Emmeline," he said. "Yes." "I told you in November that I was not a romantic man." "You did." "I want to revise that statement." She was very still for a moment. Then, slowly, a warmth came into her face that I had not seen there in all the weeks since autumn, something she had been keeping carefully in reserve. Some part of herself she had not yet offered because she had not yet been certain it was safe to offer it. "Revise it then," she said. "I did not know," he said, "when I walked into that room in November what I was walking toward. I told you I found your situation beneath you, and that was true. I told you I was in need of a wife, and that was also true. What I did not tell you, because I did not yet know it, was that I had spent 15 minutes watching you stand in that room and hold yourself together with a composure I had never seen equaled, and that by the end of those 15 minutes, I was no longer a neutral party." She was watching him with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "You didn't say so," she said. "No, I was uncertain of my standing to say so. I had asked you to enter an honest arrangement, and it seemed dishonest to color that request with a sentiment I could not fully name. And now, he said, "I can name it quite precisely." The carriage was moving through the dark, and the estate lanterns were beginning to appear at the road's edge, and he reached across the small space between them and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has spent a year keeping her own counsel, and has just decided with complete deliberateness to trust someone. "I was afraid," she said quietly, "that I was the only one." "You were not," he said. "You were not even remotely the only one. I should not have been watching. I was on the box. But there is a gap in the winter curtain, and I am a man who has spent 31 years observing a great many things, and I will not pretend I looked away." Spring came to Thornvale with the particular determination of springs that have followed difficult winters. The estate came alive in the way that well-tended things come alive when given the right conditions, not suddenly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. The kitchen garden Emmeline had been studying through the cold months produced exactly what she had planned it to produce. The accounts, which she now reviewed alongside the Duke with a regularity that had become simply a part of the household's rhythm, were in better order than they had been in a decade. The staff, who had been cautious in November and correct in December, were by March something approaching devoted. She received a letter in April from her cousin, her Uncle Aldrich's elder daughter, a woman of precise social sensibilities, which I had the misfortune to carry to her and therefore to observe being opened. The cousin wrote to express her belated good wishes, to remark upon the fortunate outcome of November's arrangements, and to inquire, with the careful indirection of the well-bred, whether there might be some possibility of an introduction to the Duke's circle of acquaintance, as the cousin's husband was seeking a certain connection that the Thornvale name might helpfully facilitate. Emmeline read it twice, then she set it down. Then she picked up her pen. I do not know exactly what she wrote because I am not in the habit of reading private correspondence, but I know how long it took, barely 4 minutes, and I know she did not seal it until she had read it once more, and she smiled slightly as she sealed it. Whatever she wrote, it was, I believe, short and precise and definitive. The cousin did not write again. There was one further occasion that I think of often in the years since. It was the following autumn, nearly a full year from the November morning that had set everything in motion. A dinner party, 12 guests, the county's notable families gathered at Thornvale in the way that notable families gather when there is a new duchess to observe. I had been at Thornvale long enough by then to know every one of the small power arrangements in the room, and I could see, as the evening progressed, that Emmeline could see them too. The merchant who had offered the insultingly low figure in November was not present. He had not been invited. The widower of 60 had sent his regrets. But Lord and Lady Carvin were present. She was the sister of the young Viscount's second son, which is to say the sister of a man who had stood in that reception room with the loose, speculative energy of someone buying at the low. and she had arrived with the particular watchfulness of a woman preparing to form a judgment. Emmeline was gracious to her, precisely, warmly gracious, in a way that gave nothing away but offered everything necessary. And when Lady Carvin said, in the soup course, with the pleasant inquiry of a woman who wishes to be told she was wrong, "I confess I wondered in the autumn when I heard, we all heard, you know, it was quite the story, whether the situation was as peculiar as it sounded," Emmeline smiled and said, "I expect it was rather peculiar by conventional measure, but I have found that conventional measure is often less reliable than it presents itself." Lady Carvin looked at her. Then she looked at the Duke, who was listening from the head of the table with the still, dark attention that was simply his natural register. "You seem very content," Lady Carvin said finally. It was, I think, as close as she could come to saying she had been wrong. "I am," Emmeline said simply. "Without performance." The Duke of Thornvale, at the head of the table, did not smile. He was not a man who smiled openly at dinner for the benefit of the assembled county. But his eyes moved to his wife, and in them was the expression I had first seen in the candlelight of the village assembly room. The look of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect and found it to be, in every meaningful respect, home. After the guests had departed and the house had quieted and I was carrying the last tray back from the drawing room, I passed the library and through the open door I saw them. She was reading. He had set down his document and was watching her read, as he sometimes did now without any particular apology. She looked up, felt his gaze, and looked back at him. "Stop watching me," she said without heat. "No," he said. She returned to her book. After a moment she said, without looking up, "I corrected another error in the autumn yields. I saw you left a note. I thought you might miss it. I never miss your notes." She turned a page, the fire settled, the library was warm. "Thornvale," she said. "Yes. I'm glad you came that morning." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "So am I," a pause, more than I have words for. She looked up at him then, and what passed between them required no words at all, which was fortunate, because I had lingered long enough in that doorway, and I was a man who valued his position, and I went very quietly back to the kitchen and told no one. In 31 years of service, I have witnessed a great many things, but I have never seen anything quite like what I saw in that reception room in November, and in the library in the years that followed. A woman who had been offered as a transaction became the heart of a household and the mind behind an estate, and the one person in the world capable of making the Duke of Thornvale look at a doorway with something in his face that I can only call hope. He had paid double the debt, and he had walked her out, and if anyone who stood in that room in November felt they had got the better of that bargain, they were reckoning without the knowledge of what Thornvale became afterward, and what the Duke became in it. He got the better of it, he knew it. And if you had asked me that November morning, standing at the sideboard, watching the most feared man in 3 counties cross a room toward a woman in a gray dress with her hands folded and her chin exactly level, whether this was going to become the great, unhurried love story of my time in service, I would have told you honestly, yes, I thought so from the very first moment. I thought so from the very first moment, and I was right.